Hi, everyone. There we go. So I just want to start today in a good way and recognize that we're here on unceded Algonquin territory. First of all, thank you for the lovely invitation. I'm always happy to come out and meet lots of very smart people who I know and have had the opportunity and honor to work with in lots of different ways through my position with the Council of Canadians. I'm the Energy and Climate Campaigner there. And I think this topic today is great. And I know it's the end of the day and you've probably had a long day and you're probably feeling pretty full. But I want us all to challenge ourselves, to ground ourselves in this moment, to really listen. Because I've had the chance to reflect on the bios of these people. I've had a chance to work with some of them, and I've had a chance to talk to some of them, and these are pretty smart people. And I think we have an opportunity to learn a lot. And I think it's really great that all of them are on board with ensuring we have lots of time for our Q&A. So we're going to keep ourselves to about 15 minutes per speaker so that we do have that time to recognize the diversity in this room and the knowledge in this room and really channels that into a conversation. And I think that's really appropriate because what we're here to talk about in this final session is getting from here to there, inspiring initiatives and mobilizing people. And as someone who's gone in circles trying to do this, different circles, organizing circles for about 10 years, maybe a bit more beyond the Council of Canadians, it starts by talking to each other. Every good campaign starts by talking to each other. So I'm glad we're going to have that opportunity to do it today. So we are going to start today off with Martin Settle, who's the Executive Director of USC Canada Actions on Global Agriculture. So if you'll bear with me for a moment, I was really excited to see that this was he was going to be part of this panel and this subject was going to be part of the panel. I had the opportunity to be at the UN climate talks in Copenhagen, and when I was there, one of the things that was a real learning curve for me is meeting members of Via Campesina from all over the world and seeing them on the streets in the cold protesting this lack of initiative and action that they were seeing, but also protesting the false solutions being peddled and promoted at the Copenhagen Climate Conference. They were on the front lines of that always. And Via Campesina is peasant farmers and local farmers. And what they were both saying is we reject false solutions, but also we have real solutions. And you actually need to listen to us and hear our leadership. So I'm so excited he's here today. So a little bit about Martin. He's passionate about social and economic justice, 2 decades of experience in social justice work, particularly related to youth services, food sovereignty, and social housing in 3 provinces, Alberta, BC, and Ontario, and in England, where he helped establish a locally sourced hot meal program. He is a chartered professional accountant and was recruited to the USC Canada Board of Directors as treasurer in 2009. He was and still is delighted to join the staff team in 2013 as Director of Finance and Human Resources. He became Executive Director along with Jane in 2016. He recently actually just returned from visiting programs in Honduras and Guatemala for the organization he's with. So come on up. I'm excited to hear from you.
Thank you, Andrea, and thank you for the invitation to be here to join with you. It's nice to actually look out and see a lot of familiar faces and a lot of unfamiliar ones. It is also exciting to know that I'm speaking to a community of relatively like-minded people, and so hopefully we can have good conversation. USC Canada, if you don't know, was founded in 1945 as the Unitarian Service Committee of Canada. For a lot of years, we were an integrated development organization doing a broad variety of activities around the world, healthcare, food, education. In the late 1980s, we got involved in working on seed resilience in Ethiopia following the drought there. And then in 2007 recognized that in fact working in agriculture and on biodiversity was the place where we could have the most impact on the world. And so since 2007 we've exclusively been focused on biodiversity in agriculture. Why agriculture? Well, I hope this will turn things on. All right. agriculture and our food delivery system, food processing system is by some accounts responsible for up to 60% of carbon emissions worldwide. In Canada, it's slightly lower, largely because of the size of our energy sector. But agriculture is a huge contributor to climate change. It also is one of the largest places where we can have impact on mitigating and adapting to climate change. The other piece is that, that's great. The other piece is that a large proportion of the world actually works in agriculture. And so when we want to talk about equity, when we want to talk about poverty, when we want to talk about agency in people's lives, we need to start with the food that they're growing, the food that they're eating, and the places they're making their impact. So the world is largely dominated by a model of agriculture that was born in the Green Revolution in the 1950s and 1960s. It's a model of agriculture that came out of really kind of a good desire, that of feeding the world. The idea that we needed more food to feed more people. And so it was founded on the idea that we needed to increase yield. The idea that more food will mean a better world. But coming with that is the idea that big is better. That the problem with that kind of agriculture is that it has a very, very high resource need. So large capital equipment to do it, high input costs. The idea behind industrial agriculture is that everything grows the same everywhere. But everywhere is not the same. And so we spend a lot of energy, a lot of chemicals, a lot of effort trying to make environments replicate each other so that we can grow food in the same way in different places. That's a very expensive, very hard proposition, and what it leads to in the long run is consolidation, larger and larger businesses running larger and larger farms with less and less people employed, producing more and more food, and a loss of agency for people in their own lives. A loss of access for those people to the means of production to grow their own food, to have their own living. So that model of agriculture is problematic. It's both fragile and it's failing. It's premised on the idea of monoculture. Again, big is better. We grow lots of food all the same way. We achieve economies of scale by going big. But monoculture is very vulnerable. It's vulnerable to pests, it's vulnerable to soil failure, and it's very, very vulnerable to climate changes. That model is also highly reliant on carbon-intensive inputs, fertilizers, pesticides, and the fuel that's needed to transport food long distances. And ultimately, it's failing us. Largely because we don't have a problem of not enough food. We have a problem with distribution of food. And the corporatization of agriculture, the increasing consolidation of that agriculture does nothing to help distribution issues. In fact, it actually creates an even bigger problem because you have fewer people controlling that distribution, trying to earn larger profits by distributing it to the wealthy. And it comes with a huge misalignment of resources. One slightly unknown fact is that industrial agriculture model produces only 30% of the food that's consumed in the world. But it uses over 70% of the agricultural resources that the world has. So it's highly expensive, highly inefficient. So what's the alternative? We do need to feed people. Well, the alternative comes really out of the idea of local agriculture by local people on small-scale farms in agroecological methods. I'm going to talk about two things quickly. First is USC Canada's own Seeds of Survival program. And then secondly, some movements at the Committee for World Food Security at the UN. Sorry, my speaking notes just went to sleep on me. So USC Canada Seeds, a survival program, started in 1989 in Ethiopia. It had such strong success that elements of it gradually got adopted into other parts of USC Canada's health and education programming around the world. We now work in 12 countries, including in Canada, working with small-scale farmers to enhance and to expand their access to a diversity of locally adapted plant genetic resources. So a lot of people know us as the seed people. Our program is founded on the ideas of food sovereignty, agroecology, and biodiversity. Food sovereignty is really about the idea that people need to have agency around the choices that they make for the production, distribution, and consumption of food in their own lives. So it's the idea of local control of food in all levels. Agroecology is a scientific approach to agriculture that is weaving together the ideas of ecology and production. So trying to farm in ways that work in mutually beneficial ways with the local environment that the plants are being grown in. And biodiversity is key to all of that. Biodiversity not only of the natural environment that surrounds the agriculture and the farms we work, but the biodiversity that we're growing within the farms. So our program is really aimed at trying to expand the diversity of the food that we're producing. It's highly built on farmer knowledge. One of the tragic impacts of the industrial model is that farmers become functionaries in an industrial process. But farmers know the land, they know the climate, they know what is needed to grow in their space. And when we remove them of that, when we remove them from that equation, we lose the ability to adapt quickly, we lose the ability to mitigate, we lose the ability to really grow as our environment changes. And so our program is really focused on saying it is the farmer's knowledge that is primary. We try to marry that with scientific researchers and scientific methods. So our program is actually developed around farmers doing their own scientific research on their own farms or in their own communities to try to address the very issues that they're dealing with. And the results can be profound. A study in Ethiopia showed that in the time since 1989, since the end of that famine, the research institutes had introduced 2 new varieties of sorghum into the fields that were being picked up. At the same time, farmers doing their own varietal selection, their own plant breeding, and accessing the heritage seeds introduced 37. So the impact of farmers doing their own research is huge. It means they're asking the questions that are relevant to them and finding answers that are relevant to them. But they need to be supported by an infrastructure that supports that research. I just used a little bit of an example of increasing diversity, but I just came back from Guatemala. Our program there is in Huehuetenango province, working in the communities around Todos Santos, Cuchumatan, which is at 3,600 meters in altitude. On the way up there, they told us that historically farmers grew potatoes and sheep. Over the last 5 to 10 years, through working with our partners in Bolivia, who also farm in the high mountains, they've adapted and I visited a farm just recently that had, I actually can't remember all of the list, but about 14 different crops with a number of different varieties of each of those crops growing on it. So that diversity is expanding their ability to feed their own family, it's changing their diets, and allowing them to actually start growing things that can be sold to their own community and reduce the need to travel long distances to sell their potatoes at larger town markets. A couple of other examples. When we started working in Honduras following Hurricane Mitch in 1996, one of the issues that people dealt with was called Los Julios, the Julys. It was the way they spoke about hunger months, hunger weeks, which is the time after which they ran out of their own stores of food before the harvest started. So hunger months, hunger weeks. When we started in Honduras, in the region we started working at, they dealt with 17 hunger weeks a year. 17 weeks that they were unable to feed their families from their own stores, reliant on outside sources of food. And 2 years ago, when we did our evaluation report, that same community reported 0 hunger weeks. That's that's the change that's saying we're going to work with diversity, we're going to grow different foods, we're going to change the farming experience so that we are diversifying, creating more resilience. That's the impact that that kind of work can have. And it's led by farmers who are saying, hey, I want to try this, I'm going to try this and grow it. One of the exciting things that's happened again over the last few years is those same farmers in Honduras have been having year after year, I don't know if you've heard, but there's been a major drought through Central America, through the dry corridor. The maize crop has entirely failed for 3 years straight. Maize is a staple of the Latin American diet. It's the staple food in tortillas. There's no maize. There's no corn. Working with our Ethiopian partners, our Honduran farmers discovered a variety of sorghum that grows on with low water and can be used to create tortillas without having to nixtalimize the end crop. And so it's actually easier to make the tortillas from it. It grows with 20% of the water that the maize requires, and they've been successfully having tortilla sorghum crops while the maize has been failing. So again, the diversity of our genetic resources allows us to adapt to the changing climate. I'm going to need to hurry up. So we do a lot of things. We do a lot of things in response to climate. The diversification of the seed stocks, looking at how do we capture and preserve water so that it can be used. Looking at models of sequential planting. When you have a variety of seed that has different growing terms, you can plant a long season crop. If that fails, you can do a midterm crop. If that fails, you can switch to a different species and try that. So by sequential planting, you can work through the season to make sure that you're getting something that grows. We also do a lot of breeding with farmers and varietal adaptation to try to make sure that the plants can be adapted to the changing climate. In Honduras, we've released 7 varieties of farmer-bred beans into the formal seed system that are now being sold amongst Honduran farmers. All of this requires policy change. Our agricultural support systems, not only in Canada but around the world, are geared towards training farmers to use industrial procedures and industrial methods. We need to change that so that our governments are supporting agroecological methods and are helping farmers better farm where they are. And we have to be careful about restrictions that are preventing farmers from breeding, from saving, from trading their own seeds. So changing policy, that was that slide. I'm going to quickly switch to the Committee on World Food Security. USC Canada has been active at the Committee on World Food Security since 2008. That committee was started in the 1970s and was completely useless for 25 years. But in 2008, with the food crisis, they were revamped. And it's a model that I think we need to be upholding a bit more. In that revamp, they determined that they needed to have a mechanism through which the voices of people, the voices of civil society, the voices of small-scale farmers could be heard. So they created a civil society mechanism which is self-organized but which has a seat at the table, seated with the governments to be able to speak to it. That mechanism, here's them self-organizing themselves. That mechanism has given voice to groups like Via Campesina, to other organizations of farmers, of pastoralists, of fishers, to bring a contrary voice to the voice that is paid for by private industry. It is under threat. And so this is one of the risks that we face. In recent years, a new organization called the World Farmers Organization, supported by private industry, has accessed a seat at the table as well as a way for them to try to undermine the voice of Via Campesina. So these are the kind of risks we face, but it's very important that those voices be heard at the UN because it's the UN that's guiding national governments in their decisions. And finally, I just wanted to kind of also make a shout out just to note that yesterday the Human Rights Council did approve and recommend to the United Nations General Assembly a declaration of rights of peasants and other workers in rural areas. It passed 33 votes for, 11 abstentions, and 3 against. It's going to the General Assembly this fall, and it would be great if our government would support it. So if you have a chance to talk to anyone in the government and suggest they support it, that would be great. Thank you very much.